he is finally able to relish his freedom.
You know, I'm trying to buy a house.
He is not bitter, but he is angry and scarred by what he saw.
It don't get no darker than watching a man go insane in the cell and you fight hard to try to save him and lose the battle. I fought, you know, to try to save men we seen going insane. It don't get any darker than that. Yeah, I can't tell you how many men that I, you know, form strong bonds of friendship with go insane, you know.
Albert Woodfox, an activist wrongfully imprisoned for 43 years, died at the age of 75 years old from complications due to COVID. Mr. Woodfox is part of what is known as the Angola Three, a group of Black men who formed a chapter of the Black Panther Party while in prison to expose the systemic failures within the prison system. Mr. Woodfox spent the overwhelming majority of those 43 years in solitary confinement within that prison, and it is believed that perhaps he has served the longest time of anyone within the prison system in solitary confinement. Let's go deeper.
In 1972, Woodfox and another inmate, Herman Wallace, both in prison for armed robbery, were accused of murdering a guard, Brent Miller. There was never any forensic evidence. The men alleged they were being punished for their black activism, and many observers thought there had been a miscarriage of justice. Were you guilty of that murder?
Absolutely not. Yeah, I'm absolutely innocent. We were the sacrificial lambs. They had already picked their demons.
After years of legal appeals, Woodfox was finally released in February of this year.
In 1971, Woodfox was serving a 50-year sentence for armed robbery at the notorious Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. And check this out. That penitentiary was built on land that was used to enslave Black people. Imagine that. The great state of Louisiana decided to build a prison on land where enslaved people were kept against their will. There is some irony and also some sick poetry attached to that, but I digressed. While in prison, Mr. Woodfox formed an allegiance with two other men, and they became known as the Angola Three. And they formed this bond to push back, yet while in prison, against systemic failures and, more importantly, rampant rape, sex trafficking, violence, and the horrific living conditions under which prisoners like Mr. Woodfox and his colleagues had to endure. And of course, that kind of activism drew the ire.
America's longest-serving solitary confinement prisoner was suddenly a free man. Ironically, the biggest shock Woodfox encountered as he re-emerged into a society in turmoil was what has not changed since he was locked up: the fight for justice and racial equality.
Yeah, the only difference is when I left, racism was brutal and open in American society. Now it's more subtle. You know, racists and bigots in this country use code words.
While in prison serving his 50-year sentence, him and two of his colleagues were convicted of killing a prison guard. None of that was substantiated. It was not proven, but he was convicted nevertheless. And Mr. Woodfox believed that that conviction was based on the activism of him and his colleagues as they formed a chapter of the Black Panther Party. I want to share a quote with you from Mr. Woodfox about the notion of solitary confinement and being in prison. And he said, "Our cells were meant to be death chambers, but we turned them into schools, into debate halls." And how inspirational it is that even through all of that negative pressure, something that changed this man's life forever, that he was able to see a glimmer of hope. And even in his darkest, saddest, most profoundly challenging moments, decided to do some good. Certainly his life is one of encouragement for each and every one of us that despite our circumstances, we can definitely be the change that we want to see in this world. There are certainly several points that I can make about this story, but I'm going to try to distill them down to two or three. Number one, that solitary confinement is something that many, not just in this country, but across the world, across the globe, see as torturous. And for anyone to have to spend the overwhelming majority of their prison sentence in solitary confinement, we got to check ourselves. That should be and could be considered a cruel and unusual punishment. Point number two, as somebody that served in the Ohio Senate and I served on the Judiciary Committee, and at a time in Ohio, even though we were talking about Louisiana, but I'm using my state as an example, where from 2008 to about 2014, in that time frame, we're really focused on how to be smart on crime and really realizing that at that time, spending over $25,000 per imprisoned person, per prisoner, was certainly not the best use of state tax dollars. Now, as we look at how to reform the criminal and justice system, we must absolutely look at prisons and how people are treated, and understanding very clearly that most people will come back into the general public, no matter where they are, Ohio, Louisiana, doesn't matter. Most people are going to come back. And the way that we treat those folks, do we try to edify their lives? Do we try to help them to recover, to pay their debt to society, and then to recover and to come back better than when they went in? In the United States prison system, we do not help these people come back better. We actually make them worse. So whether it's on the state level or the federal level, we must have some true reforms when it comes to prisons in the United States of America. And my third point I want to make is shout out to the Innocence Project for working with people like Mr. Woodfox and so many others who have been wrongfully convicted, and helping them to get back their lives, even if it's just a little bit of their life before they leave this earth. And then also to draw your attention to the fact that Albert Woodfox did write a book, and the title is Solitary. And I encourage you all to read that book. And his focus certainly is about the prolonged practice of keeping people in solitary confinement and the mental impacts that has on that individual, the entire prison system, and us as a nation. All right, we got to look out for people who have to endure these types of situations, because but by the grace of God, it could be you or it could be me.